Working as a taxi driver in a small town didn't usually bring many surprises. The rides were almost always predictable, taking someone to the grocery store, picking up passengers from bars late at night, or, at most, a trip to the airport in the neighboring city. But that night, something felt different. It was almost midnight when my phone rang. It was a call for a ride in a quiet residential area, just a few kilometers away. The area was known for its calm, large houses, tree-lined streets, and the kind of silence you only find in places where everyone goes to bed early. When I arrived, I noticed the street was completely deserted, except for a man standing under the dim glow of a streetlight. He looked nervous, tapping his foot and glancing around. Even from a distance, I could see the rapid pace of his breathing. As I pulled up, he stepped forward and quickly opened the back door. "I need to get out of town, to a village, as fast as possible. Is that a problem?" The question was direct and laced with urgency. I hesitated for a moment but nodded, indicating it was fine. He slid into the back seat, muttering the address. As I typed the destination into the GPS, the feeling that something was off began to grow, but I accepted the ride and pulled away. As a taxi driver, you learn to ignore certain things, and maybe it was just a hunch. However, the tension radiating from the passenger was impossible to ignore. The sound of the engine was the only thing breaking the uncomfortable silence between us. I tried to start some small talk, something I always did during long rides. "Busy night for you two?" My voice sounded too loud in the closed space of the car. He responded with a curt "yeah," without taking his eyes off the window. I decided not to push it, but the tension in the air seemed to grow with each passing kilometer. As we continued down the empty road, I started to notice how visibly anxious he was. His hands were shaking, and every so often, he ran them through his hair, clearly disturbed by something. I kept driving, trying not to let my own anxiety show. As we left the town, the road became increasingly deserted, only illuminated by the car's headlights. Suddenly, I saw flashing lights in the distance. 2 police cars sped past us in the opposite direction, slicing through the night like a knife, and I felt the passenger shift abruptly in the back seat. I glanced at him in the rearview mirror, but he avoided my gaze. It was becoming clear that something was very wrong. I tried to focus on the road, but my mind was racing. That's when I turned on the radio, more out of habit than anything else, and heard the news that changed everything. A violent robbery had just occurred in the very area where I had picked up the passenger. There weren't many details yet, but the location matched perfectly. A chill ran down my spine. He wasn't just a nervous passenger. He could be much more than that. The radio continued to play softly, but my hands were starting to sweat on the steering wheel. I tried not to think the worst, but it was impossible to ignore the coincidences. I was alone on the road, with a visibly nervous passenger, and now, with the confirmation that something terrible had happened in the same area he came from. As much as I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that the man in the back seat was somehow involved in the robbery. I glanced in the rearview mirror again. He was even more restless now, running his hand over his face like he was trying to calm himself down. His clothes weren't torn or dirty, but something was definitely off about him. Maybe it was the trembling hands, or the way he kept glancing out the window. His anxiety was spilling over in every gesture. He could be running from something, or someone. My heart started beating faster. Every kilometer we drove took me further away from any help. The destination he'd given was in a rural area, practically deserted at this time of night. The road was getting darker and more isolated, and I wondered what I would do if he tried something. Should I act? Should I stop the car and make a run for it? What if he was armed? The doubt grew in my mind like a weed, choking out any rational thought. I took a deep breath and tried to think of a way out. My brain was working fast. If I stopped the car suddenly or did anything suspicious, he'd notice. I needed a convincing excuse to stop, and at the same time, enough time to figure out what to do next. Then an idea began to form. I could pretend I needed to stop for gas. A gas station would be the perfect place to buy some time, and maybe even get help. The road remained dark and empty, But up ahead, a small light flickered to the side, the sign of an isolated gas station. This was my chance. I forced my voice to sound as casual as possible. "I'm going to need to stop to get gas up there. We're running low," I informed him, trying to keep it light. In the rearview mirror, I saw his expression shift slightly, his eyes narrowing. "Now?" he asked, his tone sharp, clearly suspicious. I nodded, trying not to show any fear. "Yeah, it'll be quick. Better to fill up here before we get further out." He didn't argue, but his shoulders tensed, and I could feel the weight in the air as I pulled the car up to the pump. It was a risky move, but I didn't see any other option. As soon as I got out, my heart was racing. The gas station attendant, a middle-aged man, walked slowly towards me, seemingly unaware of the tension I was feeling. As he began to fill up the tank, I desperately searched for a way to alert him. My hands were shaking, and every second felt like an eternity. "Everything all right?" he asked, noticing my nervousness. That was when I said what I needed to. In a low voice, barely audible to the passenger still sitting in the car, I whispered, "Call the police, please. Something's wrong." The attendant gave me a look of surprise and confusion, but he didn't ask any questions. He gave a slight nod and continued his work as if nothing had happened. I got back in the car, trying to act normal. The passenger was even more on edge, glancing around frequently. The silence inside the taxi was suffocating, and the tension reached an unbearable point. I knew I was playing against time now. Every second felt crucial, but there was no turning back. The sound of the gas pump felt like a ticking clock, and each second seemed to push me closer to a point of no return. The passenger was still growing impatient, looking around as if calculating his chances of escape. I knew the police were on their way, but I had no idea how long it would take. The waiting was unbearable. With the tank finally full, the attendant gave me a discreet look, a silent signal that he understood my message. But as he stepped away towards the convenience store, the tension inside the car spiked. The passenger stared at me through the rearview mirror, his eyes narrow with suspicion. "Is something wrong?" he asked, his voice low but threatening. I forced a smile. "No, we're ready to go." My hands were sweaty, but I tried not to show weakness. I started the car and was about to pull out when, suddenly, the flashing lights of police cars lit up the parking lot. My heart skipped a beat, and the passenger realized what was happening. Without warning, he tried to open the door to run, but the movement was too quick. Within seconds, the police had surrounded the taxi. Officers stepped out of their vehicles, guns drawn, shouting orders for the passenger to get out with his hands up. He hesitated, as if weighing his options, but quickly realized there was no escape. He raised his hands slowly and stepped out, being taken down by the police almost immediately. A deep sense of relief washed over me as I watched the scene unfold. When the situation finally calmed down, one of the officers approached me. He confirmed that the man I had been driving was indeed the main suspect in the violent robbery from earlier that night. The fear I had felt was now giving way to a quiet shock. I could have been a victim, trapped in a getaway with that man, but luckily, I had managed to escape before things got worse. As I got back into my car, the weight of the entire night hit me at once. A simple late-night ride had turned into something I would never forget. The radio still played softly, with news about the robbery continuing, but this time, I was safe, at least for now. It was just another night shift, nothing out of the ordinary. Driving through the streets at night was already part of my routine. The city, always lit by headlights and neon signs, felt like an old friend, familiar and comfortable, despite what many fear about working late at night. For me, it was just work, a way of life that required a certain toughness. The night was already well advanced when I stopped in front of a group of young people. Flashy clothes, loud laughter. They looked like they were coming back from a party. 3 of them got into the back seat of the taxi, still in a festive mood, and told me to take them to a more remote neighborhood of the city. Something about their casual tone made me relax, thinking it would be just another simple ride to a residential area. As I drove, I started thinking about how this kind of ride was the one I liked the most. No traffic, just the sound of the engine and the quiet city stretching out before me. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the young people distracted, each in their own world, either fiddling with their phones or chatting with each other. Everything seemed normal. A simple, ordinary ride, I thought. As we moved further, the city started to fade away, with the lights becoming fewer and farther between. It was then that one of the young men in the back seat asked me to change the route, suggesting a side street that, according to him, would cut time to the final destination. The suggestion caught me off guard. I already knew the area well and was aware that the suggested route didn't make sense. It was deserted, industrial, and almost no one used that road at that hour of the night. I glanced in the rearview mirror, trying to identify if it was just an innocent suggestion or something more sinister. There was an uncomfortable feeling in the air that hadn't been there before. Even with my instincts warning me, I decided to follow the route they indicated. The silence in the car grew heavier. The laughter from earlier had vanished, replaced by a strange quiet that made the sound of the engine seem even louder. The street, dark and deserted, stretched ahead of me, and the few streetlights flickered weakly, as if they were struggling against the surrounding darkness. Something didn't feel right, but by then, I was already committed to the new route. The discomfort inside the taxi seemed to multiply as we advanced down the deserted street. The silence in the car was deafening, and the only sound breaking that quiet was the soft hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the tires on the uneven road. I glanced again in the rearview mirror, expecting to see the carefree faces from before, but the three young men looked different. They were too quiet. Quick and almost imperceptible glances between them sent a chill down my spine. My stomach knotted. Something was very wrong. As the city lights disappeared completely, an unsettling thought began to form in my mind. I was taking these guys to a place where no one else would be around. The darkness and isolation around us created a suffocating atmosphere, as if the outside world had been turned off. The street seemed to stretch infinitely before me, and every second dragged on slower than the last. My heart began to pound harder in my chest as I tried to stay calm and convince myself that it was just a fleeting paranoia. When I turned the last corner of the street, my eyes widened. Two cars were parked in an improvised blockade, completely closing off the road. It wasn't a coincidence. It was an ambush. I felt my body go cold. The young men in the back seat went completely silent, as if they already knew what was happening. I quickly looked around, searching for a way out, but the road was completely isolated and without any lighting nearby. The men got out of the cars ahead, walking toward us with a calculated calmness. There was no rush in their steps, as if they already had everything under control. That's when I understood. I was the target. My taxi, my life, and perhaps something worse were at stake. One of the young men behind me fiddled with his phone, and somehow that made everything more real. I was trapped. My mind started racing with plans, but my body felt frozen in the driver's seat. The options were few, but I knew I had to make a quick decision if I wanted to get out of there alive. Time seemed to slow down as the men approached, their footsteps echoing in the darkness like sinister drums. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely breathe. I knew that if I stepped out of the car, it would be the end. There was nowhere to run, and they were only a few meters away. The only thing between me and them was the taxi, my only shield and, ironically, their target. It was now or never. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, my fingers sweaty and trembling. I took a deep breath, and in a split second, I made my decision. I threw the car into reverse, the tires screeching on the asphalt as I accelerated backward, trying to gain distance. Adrenaline surged through my chest as the men turned, surprised by my unexpected reaction. I had only a few seconds before they tried to block my escape route. With a sharp maneuver, I yanked the wheel to the left, making the taxi spin and point forward again. My eyes locked onto the small space between the two cars, the only spot where I might be able to escape. I knew the chances of success were slim, but staying still wasn't an option. I floored the accelerator, the car roaring forward as if it, too, knew this was its only chance. The men started shouting, but the sound blended with the roar of the engine. I could see one of them trying to run toward me, but it was too late. The taxi lunged toward the blockade. The impact was violent, with the car scraping between the two vehicles. The sound of metal against metal filled my ears as the taxi struggled to get through. I felt the car shudder, but it made it. I didn't look back. All that mattered now was getting away. The taxi trembled as I sped down the dark street, the damaged bodywork screeching in protest. The blockade was behind me, but my mind was still stuck in that moment, with adrenaline coursing through my veins. The sense of urgency still suffocated me, as if at any moment the men could reappear in the rearview mirror. I kept my foot on the gas, not daring to slow down, even with the car groaning with every meter. I glanced quickly in the rearview mirror. The cars blocking the road were getting smaller and smaller, but I could still see the figures of the men running toward me, growing more distant as the gap between us widened. They weren't armed, or at least hadn't shown weapons at that moment, but the sense of danger was undeniable. My heart was still pounding, but a small sense of relief began to creep in as I finally reached a more populated road. The city lights reappeared on the horizon, and with them a feeling of safety, though fragile. At a certain point, I slowed down, trying to control my ragged breathing. My hand still trembled on the wheel, but the worst seemed to be behind me. The car was damaged, but it was still running. A small victory, but a victory nonetheless. As I distanced myself from that place, I began to reflect on what had just happened. Why did they want my taxi? Was there something more going on that I couldn't understand? As I wondered this, the feeling of dread was still there, lingering at the back of my mind. The fear that, at some point, they might find me again, or that I might fall into another trap made me question whether it was worth continuing to work the night shift. The city would never feel the same again. I finally pulled the car over in a safe spot, still feeling the tremors of adrenaline coursing through my body. The taxi, though damaged, had brought me here. I sat in silence for a moment, trying to calm my breathing while my thoughts spun in circles. I couldn't believe I had escaped, but the sense of safety still felt fragile. The city streets, which had always seemed so familiar to me, now carried a new layer of danger I had never considered. In that moment, I began to reflect on everything that could have happened. I had heard stories like this before, of taxi drivers being attacked, but I never thought I would be next. What disturbed me most was the fact that they seemed to know exactly what they were doing, as if everything had been planned down to the smallest detail. I was just another piece in their puzzle. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to push away the fear that still hovered over me. Would I see them again? Would that group come after me, knowing I had escaped? The night was still halfway through, but I already knew I couldn't continue driving in this state. My hand still trembled slightly on the steering wheel, and a knot of fear tightened in my stomach. I decided it would be best to head home. The idea of continuing my shift seemed impossible. The night streets, which had always been so familiar to me, now seemed to hide dark secrets I wasn't prepared to face again. It was just another regular night at work. The city streets were busy, with headlights flashing and the sounds of car horns dominating the atmosphere. I had grown used to the frenetic pace of nightlife, driving through the avenues, picking up one passenger here, another there. But this ride would be unlike any other. I received the call to pick someone up in one of the busiest neighborhoods of the city, where bars and restaurants kept the streets lively. I parked at the given address and waited for a few minutes. Then she appeared. A woman with a pale face, wide eyes, and an expression that screamed desperation. She got into the cab without saying much, only giving me her destination. A far-off, isolated place, far from the noise and people. As we left the city center, I noticed her nervous state. She was fidgeting, her fingers tapping restlessly on her lap, her eyes constantly checking the rearview mirror. It was impossible not to notice, but still, I chose not to ask any questions. It was one of those nights when silence seemed like the best option. It was only a few minutes into the drive, as we moved farther away from the bright lights and crowded streets, that she finally broke the silence. "I need to get out of here as fast as possible," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm running from my husband. He's going to kill me." Those words hit me like a punch in the gut. My throat went dry instantly, and I tried to process what she had just said. I glanced into the rearview mirror, seeing her pale face and the panic in her eyes. She seemed on the verge of breaking down, and I didn't know what to say. I kept driving, trying to stay calm. "All right, I'll take you wherever you need to go," I replied, but my mind was already on high alert. My hands were sweating on the steering wheel, and my heart started to race. That's when I noticed something strange. A car had been following us for a while. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence, but as I changed routes, the vehicle remained behind us. I tried not to show my nerves, but the tension in the air was palpable. With every passing mile, my fear that something terrible was about to happen grew. What if the man she was running from really was after us? I was caught in the middle of a dangerous situation, and I knew that at any moment, things could spiral out of control. The rearview mirror became my new focal point. The car trailing us didn't seem like it had any intention of backing off, no matter how many turns I took or how twisty the route was. The woman, now noticing what I was seeing, curled up in the back seat, her eyes glued to the same mirror as mine. Every time I turned a corner or took a side street, that damned car stayed right there, relentless. "It's him, isn't it?" My voice was quieter than I intended. She nodded slowly, her eyes filled with tears, as though she were on the edge of a breakdown. I had never dealt with anything like this before. "I'm just a cab driver. I pick people up, take them to their destination, and move on with my life." But now, I was in the middle of something far bigger. My mind began racing. If this man was willing to pursue her like this, he certainly wouldn't stop now. Every time I looked at the road ahead, it seemed narrower, more desolate. I needed to think fast, needed to figure out a way to shake him off before the situation completely unraveled. But the more I sped up, the closer that other car got, clinging to us like a shadow. My heart pounded in my chest, and for a brief moment, I thought about stopping the cab, abandoning everything, and letting him take whatever he wanted. But I knew that if I did that, I might be condemning that woman to something far worse. And then, suddenly, he accelerated, closing the distance quickly, playing a dangerous game of speed on the empty streets. I was sweating now, my hands slipping on the wheel as I struggled to keep control of the cab. The woman started crying softly in the back seat, and my stomach churned. I couldn't just leave her there, but at the same time, part of me wanted to run, to leave this whole ride behind and save myself. What kind of person would I be if I abandoned someone in a situation like this? I don't know what to do, I admitted out loud, more to myself than to her. The words barely came out, my mind overwhelmed with the growing tension. The car behind us advanced again, nearly crashing into our rear bumper, and my nerves were frayed. The sound of squealing tires and headlights in the mirror seemed to push me into making a decision. She, however, did her best to keep me grounded. "Please, don't leave me," she said between sobs. "I don't have anyone else." That hit me in a way I didn't expect. Maybe because, in some way, I knew what it felt like to be alone and powerless. I couldn't leave her. Not now. I swallowed hard and kept my foot on the gas, taking sharp turns in the hopes of losing the pursuer. But it was as if he knew every move I would make, always one step ahead. The dilemma gnawed at me, but with each passing mile, I knew there was no turning back. I turned the last corner, and that's when I realized we were completely alone. The streets that once had some light from houses and shops were now deserted, and everything around us seemed darker and more oppressive. There were no more escape routes. When I looked again in the rearview mirror, I saw the car closing in on us, and then it happened. With an aggressive maneuver, he rammed his car into the back of the cab, hard enough to make the vehicle swerve, nearly throwing me off balance. My first instinct was to slam on the brakes, but as I did, the other car hit us again, this time pushing us off to the side of the road. We were trapped. I knew there was no way out. His car came to a stop just a few meters behind us, and the sound of his door opening echoed like a warning of something terrible to come. I glanced at the woman in the back seat. Her eyes were wide with fear. She was hugging herself, trying to brace for something inevitable. He stepped out of the car slowly but menacingly. My heart was in my throat. The man was big, with broad shoulders, and his expression was pure hatred. There was no way to know what he would do, but I knew it wouldn't be good. I quickly scanned the area, looking for something, anything, to use to defend ourselves. Fear clouded my mind, and all I could think of was how we were going to get out of this alive. "Get out of the car!" he shouted, his voice slicing through the night. My hands shook on the steering wheel, and for a moment, I considered doing as he said. But then I saw the woman's desperate eyes, pleading for help. I knew that if I got out of the car, it would be the end for both of us. There was no room for hesitation. In one swift move, I threw the car into reverse and floored the accelerator, slamming the cab into his car, creating a barrier between us. The impact was enough to push his car back a few meters, but it also severely damaged the cab. Smoke started billowing from the hood, and I knew the vehicle wouldn't last much longer. The woman screamed in shock from the collision, but I had no other choice. We needed to buy time, even if it was just a few seconds. "Get out!" I yelled at her as I forced the driver's door open. We bolted from the car, running down the deserted road without looking back. The sound of the man struggling to get out of his wrecked car and his furious shouts echoed behind us, but that didn't matter. We had to find safety. We ran until our legs ached. My hands trembled, and the cold night air burned my lungs. It felt like an endless sprint, but I knew we couldn't stop. Behind us, the silence was broken only by the distant sound of the man's car, still trying to start. After what felt like an eternity, I saw a faint light in the distance. It was a gas station, the only beacon of light in the midst of the dark road. We ran toward it, praying it would be a safe haven, a refuge from everything we had faced. We reached the gas station, breathless, our bodies exhausted and our minds racing. The flickering white lights of the place seemed like an oasis of safety in the impenetrable darkness of the road. We hurried inside, the woman still quietly crying, and I trying to maintain composure. The attendant, a middle-aged man with a tired look, watched us with suspicion as we approached. "We need help, fast," I said, trying to hide the desperation in my voice. "We're being chased." He glanced outside at the empty road, then back at us before picking up the phone to make a call. The sense of relief, even if only momentary, began to wash over me. While the attendant called the police, the woman sat down in one of the plastic chairs in the corner of the store, her hands still trembling. The panic in her eyes slowly started to fade, replaced by sheer exhaustion. I walked over to her, unsure of what to say. It had been a long and terrifying night for both of us, and words felt inadequate to express everything we had just been through. "Thank you," she murmured finally, her voice low and filled with fatigue. I didn't know how to respond, so I just nodded, feeling the weight of the past hours sinking in. The distant sound of sirens finally began to fill the air, and for the first time that night, I felt like everything might turn out okay. When the police arrived, the situation began to resolve itself. The man who had chased us was found still trying to fix his damaged car on the side of the road. As he was taken into custody, I watched from a distance, feeling a strange mixture of relief and unease. I knew that while we were safe for the moment, that woman's life would never be the same, and in some ways, neither would mine. Hey everyone! If you enjoyed the stories, leave a comment. Your feedback is really important to us. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. It really helps the channel. Thank you for watching.